Hey class, welcome back. We're going through chapter 27, looking at section 2, the history and culture of Japan and Korea. Keep in mind that even though Japan has become industrialized, they still respect and admire traditional arts and crafts and the people who make them. And then in both Japan and Korea, ancient traditions continue to shape life in those locations today. Our big idea. The people of Japan and Korea place a high value on their history and tradition. And our essential questions: how does Japanese culture blend traditional customs with modern innovations? And what is one difference in the way Japan and Korea have developed? Early Japanese and Korean history were intertwined, but with the passing of time, each developed independently of each other. Both were influenced by China early on due to the proximity to the Empire of China. Buddhism is going to play a role in their history and development. Chinese scholars and missionaries first brought Buddhism into Korea, and from Korea, Buddhism then spread to Japan. It became one of the main religions for both countries. So here we have it. Looking at the map, the spread of Buddhism started in India and then eventually spread into China, taken to Korea, and then eventually to Japan. Emperors, shoguns, and samurai. The first central government in Japan was based on the government in China, how they set up their empire. The early capital was located in Kyoto, and it was a center for art, literature, and learning. So heavy emphasis placed on art and literature. Some emperors were more concerned with art, and their power eventually started to step away because of that. They weren't focused on ruling the country or running the government. Japan then fell under control of powerful military leaders. These leaders were known as shoguns. They were generals, and they ruled Japan in the emperor's name, or at least they said they did, and then acted in accordance with their own thoughts and wishes. Underneath the shoguns, samurais were essentially soldiers that served under the shoguns. And we all recognize pictures of samurais when we see them, the mask and the helmets. They were fierce in battle, very loyal to their leaders, and they helped the shoguns rule Japan into the early 1800s. Samurais then. The word samurai originally meant one who serves and referred to men of noble birth who were assigned to guard the members of the imperial court. The service ethic spawned the roots of samurai nobility, both in a social and spiritual sense. As the imperial court grew weaker, the emperor lost power, local governors grew more powerful. Eventually, some developed into a daimyo, or feudal lords who ruled specific territories independently of the central government. So if you're familiar with European history at all, the same type of thing was happening in Europe. This isn't a brand new concept. The feudal lord rules over a specific territory. The one difference being that Japan really didn't have serfdoms or peasants who were tied to the land. The code of the samurai, or the bushido. So the samurai warriors had a code that they followed. It included rectitude or justice, courage, benevolence, politeness, honesty, honor, loyalty, character, and self-control. And rectitude can be a term you're unfamiliar with, but it's one's power to decide upon a course of conduct in accordance with reason, without wavering. And the samurai took it to die when to die is right, to strike when to strike is right. So it wasn't just about who's stronger, but acting within reason, having a plan, and then those other traits they would have followed as well. The bun and the bu. The bun and the bu is a term for the twofold path the samurai followed. It meant dealing with the pen and the sword. History has shown that the samurai were successful for so long because they studied both cultural and martial arts. They mastered both the pen and the sword, making them formidable intellectual and military opponents. Essentially, the warrior poet. They were very attached to art and literature and understanding culture. Later, Japan then, 1868, a group of samurai overthrew the shogun, and they gave the power back to the emperor. About this time, China had experienced essentially some takeover from the United States, Great Britain, France, Belgium. They were building what they called these spheres of influence. Japan wanted to make sure that that didn't happen to them, so they felt it was best to go on the offensive. They were trying to expand their empire in the 1900s, and eventually they allied themselves with Germany during World War II. So here we see the height of their expansion in 1942, spreading west into Manchuria and China. They wanted to make sure they had Manchuria because of the oil reserves there, and then moving to the east, taking over all of these islands. Aggressive action and bombing of Pearl Harbor drew the United States into the war. So, here we have the Hawaiian Islands, Pearl Harbor, able to create that do not pass line, essentially. The U.S. responded to the Japanese aggression after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. They dropped the atomic bomb on 2 Japanese cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and this brought about the surrender of Japan. This wasn't something that the United States took lightly. They went back and forth on it for quite a while. And what they felt was, because of the occupation of these smaller islands, it would have taken, the cost would have been great using U.S. troops to move the Japanese off those islands and take control back. And they felt that by dropping the bombs, the Japanese would understand that we have greater military power than you. You need to essentially come to your senses on this. So here we just have a close-up Nagasaki and then Hiroshima. The bombs were devastating. It wiped out miles and miles of Japanese city and countryside. But here we see, in a relatively short amount of time, from the 1940s to today, so 80 years, and the rebuild with that is pretty significant. Korea, the Korean Peninsula has long been influenced by China. Korea's kind of had a tough go of it. They've had periods of independence, but then they've also had periods of where they were controlled by either China or Japan. And the occupation by Japan, the Koreans felt that the Japanese were just not very nice to them. After World War II, independence was returned. The Koreans voted to form 2 countries. So this is where we have the split. It was after World War II, North and South Korea. North Korea fell under the influence of the Soviet Union, and South Korea was aided by the United States. About this time, communism was starting to spread to a lot of different places. The U.S. wanted to use a containment method to stop the spread. So initially, they got involved in the Korean War. In 1950, North Korea wanted to unify the entire peninsula under a communist government. The U.S. came to the aid of South Korea. The war was costly, and the effects of that war still linger today, and we'll talk more about that in section 4. So Japanese culture reflects their long and varied history. Language, nearly everyone in Japan speaks Japanese. Japanese is complicated and hard to learn, and this results from using 2 different types of characters. They have the kanji, which represents whole words, and the kana, which represents parts of words. Religion is complicated as well. They basically had a blending. Buddhism was brought to the islands, we discussed that, and then native to the Japanese islands was Shintoism, and the Japanese essentially blended the 2 together Shinto is a belief in nature spirits. If you practice Shintoism, you believe that everything has its own spirit. Buddhists, on the other hand, seek enlightenment in their everyday activities. Both religions have shrines and temples built around the islands. Customs and traditions. Traditional forms of art and clothing remain popular in Japan. They still practice a form of dramatic plays. One of those is Noh plays, N-O-H, and they use music and dance to tell a story. The characters remain pretty stationary, and they wear masks to show emotion. This would be an example of a Noh mask. And then they have the kabuki plays, which are more active, and the purpose of those plays is to teach a character or moral lesson. And this represents a kabuki mask. You've maybe seen that before. Any of you Star Wars fans, you probably recognize this. Looks pretty similar to Darth Maul, the villain in Episode 1. If you see that connection, hang on to that thought, because we'll come back. So Korea's culture is a reflection of the long history on the peninsula. Traditional ways still influence how they live, act, and think. Language and religion. Korean is the dominant language. It's written with an alphabet. It's not as complicated as Japanese. A large percentage of Koreans are Buddhists and Confucius. Christianity has become more prevalent, though. About 25% of South Koreans practice Christianity. North Korea, on the other hand, discourages religious practices, which generally is associated with communist types of government. Customs and traditions. Many ancient customs and traditions are still practiced today within Korea. Traditional food and art remain very popular. This is a picture of a dish known as kimchi, and it's a spicy pickled cabbage, traditional food in Korea. North Korea encourages its citizens to keep the old traditions alive. They don't want them seeking out modernization. South Korea, on the other hand, has become more westernized and modern, the adoption of a modern lifestyle. Entrance ticket 2. What role did shoguns play in Japan's government? What is one form of art that remains popular in Japan today? And what has led to many of the differences between modern culture in North and South Korea? Remember to have your entrance ticket completed prior to arriving in class on the assigned day. We'll see you next time.